Good morning and welcome. Hello, how are all my favorite humanists out there in OGGM land? It's the third day of July 2022. It's about, I don't know, 9 o'clock in the morning. It's 61 degrees and mostly cloudy here. Remember, it is July 4th weekend, so if you have pets, make sure they're indoors and they can't get out because all the explosions and the fireworks will upset them. All right, normally I don't do things on Sunday, but I found a list, and we haven't done a list in a while. And as usual, this list comes to us from CBR, comicbookresource.com, which means the individual who created it did very little, if any, actual research, which is, usual for them. So we have 10 classic fantasy monsters that originated in D&D. This should be interesting. I mean, there are some monsters, especially in the later years, that D&D did create, but 90% of every monster you encounter is based upon either pop culture, books, movies, or mythology. So, and some of the more weirder stuff, as we got later on in Monster Manuals, is just sort of reskinned versions of things that already existed in more obscure names and more obscure references to religions and mythologies and science fiction and fantasy. Actual original monsters that D&D created that weren't based upon anything, they're probably out there. I don't know how many, but we'll see what the list says. Number 10, Kobolds. 10 classic monsters that originated in D&D. Kobolds. No. Did not originate in D&D. Kobolds, or Kobolds, the Norse mythology, I know they existed before D&D. Let's see. Japanese media has it. I think they're from, stuff. They appeared in all their other things. Now, maybe the way we picture kobolds now, but even the way we picture kobolds now is not the original way D&D pictured kobolds. They've changed the way they look, but the original idea comes from Old Germanic, so no. Bugbears. Nope. That is not something that D&D invented. Again, they come from early Middle English mythology and folklore, and they are neither bug nor bear. So just the idea of a brooding, hulking thing in the woods, a boogeyman, that's Middle English. Perhaps the way we picture them now, the way they're portrayed in video games, and, but how often do you see anything actually referred to as a bugbear in anything other than specifically D&D? I mean, I can't think of any time I've ever seen a cartoon or an anime where they went, bugbears! They're usually just goblins. Gnolls! Gnolls, actually, jackal people, Egyptian mythology. That goes straight back to Anubis and the children of Anubis. The first using of the word gnoll appeared in a book called The Book of Wonder. But I'm not even sure that's actually the first appearance of the word. I know the first appearance of the iconography, the imagery. God, you can't talk. I'm an idiot. Egyptian mythology, Anubis and the children of Anubis. Liches. Undead wizards. No, I mean, that's Fritz Lieber. Lankmar, Fafford and Grey Mouser. They, both worked for vastly powerful undead wizards. The word lich, when we know the word phylactery comes from Jewish mythology and religion, and the word lich is in Old English meaning corpse or something like that. Generic undead threat. Now, D&D, with the Demi-Lich and the Lich and Vecna and a Sarasac, and especially all the press that's getting lately, the Lich might be very much influenced by the way D&D, portrayed it, but, The giant undead skeletal overlord. That's Skeletor, right? I mean, how much of Skeletor is from D&D, and how much of D&D's imagery of liches is from Skeletor? I mean, that's it's a weird one, because that imagery existed before D&D started using the word lich. And D&D got the word lich from Old English, used it to be the name for the undead wizard. But again, that idea, that imagery existed before D&D used it. But then, D&D... that one's hard. And I think it all goes back to Skeletor. So I think, some love for our boy Skeletor. Dreiders. Okay, so if you don't know what a Dreider is, because it's a pretty obscure reference, and they don't see a lot of love anymore. Basically, it is a male drow elf, if I remember correctly, who has failed Loth's test and has therefore been transformed by Loth into a half-arachnid, half-humanoid monstrosity as punishment for not living up to Loth's expectations. So imagine, the body of a scorpion with the head and torso of a dark elf male. Centaur, but not. Now, the idea of humanoid scorpions, that's appeared before. Drow, Ray Harryhausen, and other early sci-fi fantasy films had half scorpion, half human, half spider, half human. The idea of a drow, and dark elves are not D&D because those also come from, old Celtic mythology, old English mythology, old folklores. The Norse mythology had the dark elves. So the idea that a Loth's punishment for a dark elf that failed her is being turned into a monstrosity of half spider or half arachnid, half humanoid, that I'll give that one to D&D. As far as I know, that one is very specific. The word drow, spider, dreider, they might have even invented that word because it's just a drow spider, right? Drow, spider, dreider. Motorcycle rider. Dreider, motorcycle rider. So that one I will 90% give to D&D. Lich, 80% I'll give to D&D. Where are we? Null, 10% I'll give to D&D. Bugbear, I mean, you never even hear that word. When was the last time you fought a bugbear in D&D? Much less anything else. That one, I don't know. Kobold, I don't know, video games and anime might be more responsible for our imagery and understanding of kobolds than D&D. So, I mean, no take candle, right? So, I don't know. Kobolds, 70% D&D. Bugbear, well, the only time it's ever mentioned is in D&D and very rarely, so I don't even know. That one I'll give 5%. Null, I'll give 40%. Lich, I'll give 50%. Dreider, I'll give 90%. Number 5, Displacer Beast. Let's see, the idea of a cat that is and is not there. The idea of a cat that is or is not there. Now, the original idea of the creature comes from something called the Coeurl, Coeurl, which is from a 1950s science fiction book called The Voyage of the Space Beagle. But the way we picture them now, 6-legged cats. I don't know. First, why do they have 6 legs? I don't know. I guess because somebody wanted them to have a claw bite attack. The tentacles, that's Lovecraftian. The idea of a displacer cat, that's Schrodinger's cat. But the idea, very specific imagery of 6-legged cat with tentacles, that's sort of based upon the way they were described in the science fiction book, but also just sort of D&D's thing's own. So that one's 60% D&D. The Boule. This Boule, as we know, comes from, well, the story is Gary Gygax bought a pack of 99-cent store dinosaurs from that day. And it had, a couple of the normal everyday dinosaurs in it, like a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a, Stegosaurus. But then it had these weird things in it. One of the weird things was this sort of strange four-legged bullet-shaped creature, which they called the Boule. But did they actually invent this? No, because what Gary Gygax didn't know, and which later been discovered, is the pack of 99-cent store dinosaurs that Gygax bought to represent monsters for D&D was actually a pack from Japan of monsters that had appeared in early Ultraman. So Tim Krass, who supposedly created it, says that the interpretation comes from the idea of a land shark, a creature that can rush through Earth as easily as it runs along the ground and possessing a tremendously long bite. Tremendously powerful bite. The imagery is iconic, but no, it comes from various kaiju from the classic Ultraman. So D&D did not invent this one. D&D might have made it more recognizable in public culture, but really it's from Japanese monster movies, so 50-50. Rust Monster. Actually came from the same bag of toys. And this one was weird because we had all these dinosaurs in this bag and then this weird insect, which actually, again, comes from our Ultraman. And then here we have this sort of almost cartoonish looking propeller-tailed lobster monster that, we didn't know what it was. So Gygax was like, well, what's the most frightening thing I could think of for this poor little sort of cast-off monster? Not knowing that it was an Ultraman monster, he was like, Gygax was very big into wandering traps. Slimes, undead, things, oozes, anything where he could basically have the trap follow the players instead of just being stationary hole in the ground. He really liked those ideas, and that's sort of the idea of wandering traps like slimes definitely comes from him, and probably just early influences on the time of the 70s. But the idea of a rusting armor, that being like the most frightening thing he could think of to throw against characters at that point in time, because remember, at this point in time, we're basically dealing with guys in armor fighting these fantasy monsters as D&D progressed from just a tactical board game, military reenactment using fantasy, to slowly becoming the role-playing thing that we're aware of. The very earliest characters were just, these knight figures. So what's the most frightening thing you could throw against a guy who's completely dependent upon armor and weapon? Well, what if I created a monster that could run up to you, wasn't interested in you, just wanted to eat your armor? Yeah, so Rust Monsters, I will give 90% to D&D. Mind Flayers, that literally Lovecraftian. Brain-eating, tentacle, outer planar, totally Lovecraftian. So I'll give that one 30% to Gygax and D&D. Everything else just Lovecraftian, and just the idea of tentacle monsters. Japan has probably made tentacle monsters more relevant in pop culture than D&D. And number one, the Beholder. Did Gary Gygax and company come up with the idea of a floating eye that shot laser beams? No, again, that's from anime and giant, kaiju and early science fiction. But the iconic version of the Beholder with the eyes shooting different lasers and being completely random. Yeah, that's totally them. The image of a floating eye with eye stalks prowling and dungeons and stuff and being a horrible monster. And that's not theirs, but everything else about a Beholder, that's 100% theirs. So I'm going to give 99% yes, our idea of the way we picture beholders now is completely D&D. Number one. Number two, Mind Flayer. I'll give 30% of that is D&D. The rest of it is just Lovecraftian and Japan's obsession with tentacle monsters. Rust monsters, yeah, that's 99% D&D. Boule, 60-40. I mean, you don't often see a Boule show up in D&D or even get mentioned in D&D or in D&D things, but definitely big in anime and definitely big in giant monster kaiju. So that's 60% kaiju, Japan, 40% Gygax. Displacer Beast, that's Schrodinger's cat with an extra arm and legs. The idea is not original, but the way we picture it, the cat with tentacles, that's totally, again, based loosely on a science fiction book. So yeah, I'll give that one 80% to D&D, the rest to just Schrodinger's cat and Japan's obsession with tentacles. Dreider, that one's like very specifically, this one is 100% D&D. Okay, the half drow elf, half spider, even the name Dreider. The imagery is from other things, but the very specific idea, Ray Harryhausen did do some half human, half scorpions, but Dreider, a drow elf that has been punished by Loth to be this horrible combination of arachnid and humanoid, that's 100% D&D. I'll give that one to D&D. Lich, that one's kind of confusing. The word comes from a different source. The idea comes from mythology and folklore. But then we're going into, late 70s, early 80s. We're getting Japanese fantasy cartoons. We've got Skeletor. Obviously, the way we picture a Lich now is 100% based upon Skeletor. So that one's 60-40 again. Null, that's 10% D&D, 70% just ancient Egyptian folklore and mythology. Jackal people go all the way back to Anubis, god of the dead, and that iconography, which you can just see in pretty much any museum that has a display of Egyptian mythology. The word, who knows where that word comes from? It's probably just a made-up word, but the iconography, definitely Egyptian. Most recognizable dog people, you've seen them in anime, you see them in video games. Sometimes they're referred to as the word null. You don't see that much, even though D&D didn't come up with the word. I'll give it that the word is kind of theirs, but the imagery definitely not is there. So that one, 40% D&D, the rest just common, whatever. Bugbear, that's a weird one. Because the only time you ever hear it even mentioned, it is D&D, but you hardly ever hear it mentioned in D&D. The actual idea, again, Middle English folklore, mythology, but the actual, no wonder you're at number 9, Bugbear, just because you're sort of a forgotten monster. And Kobolds at number 10. The way we picture Kobolds now is half video games. You can't really say D&D is responsible for the way we picture Kobolds, since D&D keeps changing the way Kobolds look. So yeah, that one, 10% D&D. The rest just video games, anime, cartoons, general public perception, the actual word coming from Middle English. So 10 of these, the only one that I can say that D&D 100% created is the Dreider and the way we picture the Dreider. But how often do you actually see a Dreider? Again, the same with Boule. If we're going by just how monsters you see the most of based upon this list, Kobolds should be at number 1. You see them more than any other thing. I mean, almost every D&D adventure, there's a 40% chance you're going to run into Kobolds. Bugbears, when was the last time you ran into one of those? Gnolls, when was the last time you saw one of those? Liches, very rarely. There's a few iconic liches, and then every other than that, hardly ever. Dreiders, again, when was the last? Hardly ever, especially since they changed Dro. Displacer Beast, that's another one you hardly ever see. Boule, again, you hardly ever see Boules. They're very specific. Rust monsters don't get as much love as they should. You'd think you'd see them more. Mind Flayers, again, very rarely showing up in D&D. Beholders, another one. I mean, you might run into 1-2 Beholders your entire adventure life. On the other hand, Kobolds. Kobolds are almost in every game and every adventure. There's a chance, at least 30% chance, you're going to run into Kobolds. So I would think Kobolds is at number one, at least for how often you run into them. As to whether D&D created them or not, the only one I can say D&D 100% created, Dreider. Everything else is sort of based upon just 100 different things. So, yeah. It's very rare that I agree with a CBR list, but I will definitely say that even if D&D did not create these monsters, D&D is indirectly responsible for making these monsters more available to pop culture, either directly or indirectly, which is a whole nother thing. Indirect perception of what something is based upon collective unconsciousness. That would be a topic of a completely separate vlog. But anyways, we hadn't done a list in a while. I've wasted 20 minutes of your time talking about this, and then I'm going to waste 20 minutes more of your time by doing Minecraft. Apparently I can't talk, but it's Sunday, so I don't have to. If you appreciate nonsense like this, let me know. If I got anything wrong, let me know. Because, I'm happy to fix my mistakes. Till next time, yeah. What's your favorite monster on this list? Mine's probably the Rust monster. Yeah.